former U.S. presidents have visited North Korea. President Trump is the first to do so while in office.
Stepping across that line was a great honor. A lot of progress has been made.
So both of those statements about the honor and the progress call for some clarification. As for the honor, the president was enhancing his personal relationship with an autocratic ruler. And as for the progress, the president is hoping that relationship will lead to a nuclear agreement later, although previous talks have fallen apart.
NPR's Scott Horsley covers the president, has for quite some time. Hey there, Scott.
Good to be with you, Steve.
Did this meeting with Kim Jong-un really come about in a day, which is the way that the president presented it on Twitter?
You know, Steve, the Gettysburg Address was not actually composed on the back of an envelope.
Oh.
And there was certainly speculation that Trump would visit the DMZ while he was in South Korea. He had tried to go a couple of years ago and couldn't get there because of bad weather. And then on Saturday morning, the president tweeted that, hey, if Kim was around and he'd like to get together while Trump was at the DMZ, Trump would be up for a handshake and a hello. The White House tried to portray this as completely impromptu. Trump told reporters he just had the idea that morning. That's probably an exaggeration, maybe to reduce the risk if Kim, for some reason, didn't show up. We do know that Trump talked about the idea of meeting Kim at the DMZ in an interview with the Hill newspaper a week ago, but the White House asked the paper not to publicize it, citing security concerns. That said, this does seem to have come together rather quickly. I can tell you there was a row of flags behind Trump and Kim when they met in Freedom House, and it appears that the American flags were actually ferried in on the helicopter that was used to bring reporters to the site.
Okay, so Freedom House, that's right on the demilitarized zone, right? That's
on
what
the
you're
southern side, that's right.
Okay, and so they're in this building. They sit for an hour. They talk for an hour. Do you have a good sense of what they discussed?
We don't know a lot about what was discussed. It certainly did go a lot longer than the president had initially advertised. He'd said to expect just a quick handshake and maybe a 2-minute chat, and as you say, they were there for nearly an hour. The president did tell reporters after the meeting that he and Kim had agreed to restart talks about denuclearization. They will appoint teams to do that, he said, in the next few weeks. Now, of course, they've had teams talking about denuclearization before, and they've been unable to bridge the fundamental differences over what that term actually means to the two sides and what the sequencing ought to be. The president did say, for now, U.S. sanctions on North Korea would remain in place. No quick relief on that front. But he did leave open the possibility that sanctions could be relaxed in the future as the talks progress.
And the president also invited Kim Jong-un to drop by the White House if he was in the neighborhood?
This wasn't something that the president volunteered. He was asked by reporters if he'd be open to extending such an invitation, and he very quickly said, sure. I think for Trump, a White House visit is kind of like stepping over that raised barrier between North and South Korea. He likes the pageantry of the bold gesture, and he's not particularly burdened by a lot of second-guessing over whether this is the right time or what's the protocol. That said, Trump did tell reporters he is in no hurry to play host to Kim Jong-un.
There's a good feeling, so it could be very good. As far as another meeting, I think let's see what happens today before we start thinking about that.
Trump said, we're not looking for speed, we're looking to get it right, no matter how quickly this little photo op over the weekend was put together.
Scott, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
And when you talk about looking to get it right, there are all the details of a nuclear negotiation, essentially all of them. So let's discuss that with NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe. Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
And one reason it's good to talk with you is that you covered the summit in Vietnam that fell apart with no agreement whatsoever, in fact, ended early. So after this dramatic meeting this weekend, what remains to be done?
Well, the big thing, I've been talking to analysts about this, and what they all agree is that there has to be some movement with these lower level negotiators, with these teams that they're setting up. President Trump has made clear that he has the final say so, and he likes to focus on these personal relationships between leaders. But negotiations have to be able to move forward, not just when Kim and Trump talk face to face, because there are all these issues that need to be ironed out, and both sides need to get on the same page. So that's what's going to be key keep moving forward? Are there actual working level talks, and are they consistent? And is there movement beyond kind of the letters and the nice words? Is the U.S. going to be willing to offer anything on sanctions relief to North Korea for actions short of full denuclearization? And then what is North Korea willing to offer? At Hanoi, it offered the Yongbyon nuclear facility, and Trump said that wasn't enough.
And you're pointing at the essential difficulty that negotiators have faced all along. The United States wants all sanctions to remain in place until North Korea has fully denuclearized. The North Koreans want some benefits along the way to even move in that direction, and there's a lot of skepticism about whether they ever would be willing to denuclearize. So you've got some fundamental issues that we don't have answers to. But Aisha, I want to ask about something else while I have you. Even though there was no agreement with North Korea, there was a meeting over the past week with Chinese leaders. So was there any progress in the trade war with China?
Well, so the U.S. and China agreed to kind of restart trade talks, and the Trump administration agreed to hold off on imposing new tariffs. So it was kind of like a truce and a restarting of talks, and China agreed to increase its purchases of U.S. agricultural products, which is very important to Trump. He's always talking about U.S. farmers and how important they are to him.
Okay, so there's not actually a trade agreement there, but an agreement to keep talking, and some things will change. And the president also made a move regarding Huawei, the tech giant that the U.S. has described as a security threat.
Yes, so U.S. tech companies will be able to keep supplying components to Huawei. And so that is something that President Trump was willing to put on the table.
Is there anything in common when you look at his approach to North Korea and the president's approach to China?
Yeah, both of these are issues that have been going on for a long time. They have frustrated and vexed many presidents before Trump, and Trump has promised to fix these situations. He is trying things that other presidents have not. He's kind of making these bold moves, whether it's tariffs with China or making kind of bombastic threats against North Korea, followed by these historic meetings with North Korea's Kim. And so there's pageantry and headlines and big dramatic moments. But ultimately, it's an open question how much progress is actually being made. Right now, you kind of have the status quo holding with both situations, and how the administration gets from this point where they're at right now to kind of game-changing deals, that's what's really unknown.
Aisha, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Aisha Roscoe. Today is a holiday in Hong Kong, marking 22 years since the end of British colonial rule and the restoration of control by China.
The date brings a lot of mixed feelings in Hong Kong. At the time of the handover, residents were assured of maintaining the relative freedoms they enjoyed under British rule. Today, they protested again to maintain those freedoms. That's the sound of these clashes between protesters who were crowded in the streets and police. Today's events continue. Demonstrations against a bill that would allow extraditions from Hong Kong to mainland China. NPR's Julie McCarthy is in Hong Kong covering today's demonstrations. Hi there, Julie.
Hi, Steve.
Can you give us proper perspective on these protests? The TV images look pretty dramatic. There are images of people trying to smash into Hong Kong's legislature by crashing a cart against glass walls. But how do these protests compare to others in recent weeks and months?
Well, the others in recent weeks involved millions of people. We don't know what the numbers are yet here, but events are evolving and quickly. At the moment, protesters right outside my window have gathered near that very legislative council, and they were throwing what our producer says were eggs at the police who were just standing by. Protesters reportedly, as you said, smashed a glass door there and are now shouting very loudly. Up the street was a whole different issue, a whole different scene. All age groups were assembling in a peaceful, very large numbers. Some of them may be joining those below.
Now, that is a notable detail that the police are just standing by. That's something that calls for discipline, to be egged in that situation, I guess, and do relatively little in response. Does it seem then the police have been restrained today?
Well, earlier in the morning they weren't. They were using pepper spray and batons, but right now they do seem to be standing by. They've been accused of using excessive force, but they've also taken great pains. They're very tight security, and there's huge cordons around. For example, the highly symbolic flag-raising ceremony went off without a hitch. Earlier this morning, the Chinese and Hong Kong flags were hoisted side by side, a display that underscores that Hong Kong is squarely part of China.
And let's remember what this is about. Mainland China has sovereignty over Hong Kong, but is assured for half a century certain rights to people in Hong Kong. There were protests against this extradition bill, which has been suspended. It has been delayed without being voted on and passed. What do the protesters want now?
Well, what they want is that thing not suspended, but completely withdrawn. They have very little faith in the word of their governors that they think it's far from dead. So there is a suspended animation about this extradition bill, and I kind of watched that very thing today. The Hong Kong rulers took their place inside this cavernous hall. They were watching the flag raising from a safe distance. They clinked champagne glasses after Chief Executive Carrie Lam told them that the one country, two system arrangement, meaning China's one party and Hong Kong's quasi-democracy, was succeeding. Now, the fact that there are so many people on the streets attests to a vibrant free speech in Hong Kong, but they are out there marching because they think they are losing those freedoms.
Julie, thanks for the update. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Julie McCarthy reporting from Hong Kong.
You can find toxic content on all corners of social media. But what if it's coming from U.S. federal agents?
Well, the investigative newsroom ProPublica revealed offensive posts about migrants, and those posts were on a secret Facebook group that was said to be designed for current and former Border Patrol agents. Now, it's not clear that everybody on the site was an agent, but ProPublica identified some who appear to be. And the people targeted by the posts include Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She happened to be part of a group of lawmakers who toured border detention facilities yesterday. Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas was also part of that group.
When we went into the cell, it was clear that the water was not running. There was a toilet, but there was no running water for people to drink. In fact, one of the women said that she was told by an agent to drink water out of the toilet.
NPR's Franco Ordonez is covering the story and joins us in studio. Thanks for being here, Franco.
Thank you.
I'm going to get to that Facebook page, but I want to start with this visit by the Democratic lawmakers to the border. What more did they say about what they saw?
Well, it was about a dozen members who visited these facilities. And if you remember, some of these facilities in Texas have come under incredible scrutiny after reports of overcrowding and squalid conditions. This is a group that visited these facilities, and as you just played in that clip, they met with about a dozen women in one facility and did not find running water. As Joaquin Castro said and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have said, they're very concerned that they do not have water to drink and that they're being forced to do so out of unsanitary conditions.
And we should say these are some of the lawmakers who were actually opposed to the congressional bill that was passed, passing all this humanitarian aid to the border. They didn't think it was enough.
Absolutely. This is a group that was very critical of the bipartisan bill that the House and the Senate passed. But this group wanted a lot more tougher protections for migrants and migrant children specifically. So this visit comes on the heels of that controversy. Therefore, there was already a lot of lack of trust walking in.
Mm-hmm. So let's get to this Facebook page. This is coming from a report from ProPublica. They are reporting the existence of this private Facebook page that had all these offensive posts. We're not going to say explicitly describing them, but can you give us a general sense of what these posts say?
Yeah, I mean, the group is called I'm 1015. It refers to a code for migrants in custody. It boasts thousands of members, current and former. That's still a little bit unclear. But as you point, what was revealed in these posts is what was really eye-catching. Jokes about throwing burritos at these visiting lawmakers, deaths of migrants. One particular issue was personal illustration of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. appearing to perform a sex act on the president. She responded last night saying that it showed a violent culture in the Border Patrol.
Misogynistic statements, racist statements. What is the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection saying about this?
U.S. Customs and Border Patrol is saying that this is completely inappropriate, that it's contrary to the integrity of everyday agents, that all employees found will be held accountable, and they are talking about an independent investigation by the Inspector General.
All right, NPR's Franco Ordonez, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what remains of the Iran nuclear deal? You know, the one the U.S. dropped out of and that Iran is now exceeding.
Iran confirmed on Monday that it has gone beyond the limit for enriched uranium that is called for by the agreement with world powers. Iran says it has a right to break that rule because the world powers are not keeping the bargain to boost Iran's economy. Speaking on Fox, President Trump said Iranians are playing with fire.
They're having a lot of difficulty in their country right now. And hopefully at some point they'll come back and they'll say, we're going to make a deal. We'll see what happens.
Other nations have been trying to save the deal that already exists.
NPR correspondent Deb Amos joins us now from Berlin. Hi, Deb.
Good morning.
So Iran has now breached a fundamental tenet of the nuclear agreement. How is Europe responding?
The statements out of European capitals have all been essentially the same, which is we're concerned, and they all urge Iran to stick to the nuclear deal, but short of next steps. Now, this breach seems to be intended to pressure the Europeans to deliver on the economic benefits that Iran was promised in the nuclear deal and has been wiped out by these new U.S. sanctions. But it's going to be very hard for the Europeans to deliver.
I mean, how does it even work? Can European nations do business with Iran outside of U.S. sanctions?
Well, here's an example. Germany did the biggest trade with Iran, 60 businesses. It has essentially collapsed. So the Europeans have put together this barter system. It's the Germans, the French, and the UK. And they say that it's up and running. It's only going to deliver food and medicine. But here's a problem with the barter system. You have to have money on both sides. Iran wants Europe to establish a credit line because they can't sell their oil. And Iran just doesn't sell enough pistachios and carpets to make this whole thing work. And then there's one other thing, and that is European companies don't want to take the risk to trade with Iran, even on goods that aren't under sanction, because they are so worried they'll get shut out of the U.S. market.
So what now? I realize this is a huge question, but what events does this now trigger, Iran's violation of the deal?
So this can be reversed. What everybody's watching for is the next steps. And there's a deadline of July 7th when Iran says that they will have more serious breaches of the nuclear accord. That we have to watch for. It raises the stakes for Europe. There's more meetings in Europe to see if they can find some way. European powers have resisted reimposing their own sanctions. But ultimately, if Iran goes further, they risk alienating the UK, France, and Germany. Those are the signatories to the deal. Russia and China, those are the other signatories. They will likely side with Tehran if this whole deal collapses. So you're looking at a new fault line if there's any potential conflict.
You can see the dilemma the Iranians actually face here. The U.S. is banking on the idea that the U.S. is so big, so powerful that it can implode this whole deal. It can wreck this whole deal. The Iranians and the Europeans have been trying otherwise, but essentially Iran's threat is, if this keeps going, we will destroy the deal, which is what the U.S. actually wants.
Right.
And that puts Iran that puts the Europeans in a very tough position.
Right. NPR's Deb Amos for us on this. Thanks, Deb. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Local prosecutors in Washington, D.C. are experimenting with a new response to crime.
When that crime involves young offenders, prosecutors can try to connect the suspects with the people they hurt in a process that avoids traditional criminal prosecution.
It's an idea called restorative justice, and our national justice correspondent, Carrie Johnson, was able to get a close look at how it's playing out right here in the district. Hi, Carrie.
Hey, Rachel.
So tell us about this program.
It does bring together young people. These are juveniles under age 18, accused of breaking the law in some fashion with the victims they've allegedly hurt. And the program is designed to be focused on the victim. There are a few ground rules. It must be voluntary. Victims have to agree to participate. The program is only open to juveniles who don't use guns during their crimes. Serious sexual assaults are also not acceptable to participate in this program. And then if the young people actually follow through on the plans that they develop with their victims, their charges get dismissed. It's something that's been around in some form for a long time, but DC is trying to turbocharge it.
Do the prosecutors buy into this whole thing? Prosecutors usually like to prosecute people.
They do indeed. And there was a lot of skepticism coming in when this program launched. But I've spoken with prosecutors in the office who say they've sat through these sessions and they believe it actually it has the potential to change young people's hearts and minds, making them less likely to commit new crimes. Data is early and sparse, but so far, authorities in D.C., the D.C. Attorney General Karl Racine says he thinks it looks successful.
So you got a chance to talk to someone, a young man, a victim who actually went through this process. What did he tell you?
Yeah, believe it or not, it's a police officer who was himself the victim of an assault. He's with the Metro Transit Police. His name is Jason Dixon. About a year and a half ago or longer, Dixon was trying to break up a fight on the subway system here in D.C. among a group of kids. He took the brunt of the attack as he got in the middle of this scuffle. He actually tore his rotator cuff, strained his knee, was out of work for 3 months. But when prosecutors called, Dixon says he opted for a restorative justice session rather than take this case to court.
If this was my son and somebody saw an opportunity to help him, I would hope that person would take that opportunity, and I saw something in this young man that I felt like it was enough to me to say, hey, I know I'm injured, but I want to see how I can change his life to the point where he doesn't make a decision like this again.
And here's how this played out afterwards. They did one of these restorative justice conferences. Dixon and his wife, who's also in law enforcement, attended. This young man attended with some of his community supporters, and then there were people from the D.C. Attorney General's office. They agreed that this young man was going to call Dixon once a week for 6 months, avoiding a possible criminal record. And in the end, Officer Dixon, the victim of a crime, wound up offering parenting advice to this 16-year-old who hurt him, himself a new father.
It's interesting because I was going to ask, why is the focus on young people here? Couldn't it work for everyone? But clearly they see it as a chance to change someone's life at an early stage. Just quickly, Carrie, are there other jurisdictions considering programs like this?
A number of states have been opting into some of these programs. The difference here in D.C. is that they've brought it in-house. These counselors and restorative justice personnel work right down the hall from prosecutors, hoping it will cause more prosecutors to appreciate the process and buy into it.
NPR's Justice correspondent Carrie Johnson. Carrie, thank you for sharing this. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.
You never really want to have any situation described as a ticking time bomb, but that's how a senior manager at a Border Patrol detention facility described conditions at one site that he'd seen.
That description was part of a damning report that came out yesterday about conditions in those facilities. But this didn't come from immigrants' rights groups or a partisan group. This report was released by the Department of Homeland Security's own Inspector General. It calls out U.S. Customs and Border Protection for dangerous overcrowding in its holding cells and says conditions, quote, require immediate attention and action.
NPR's John Burnett is on the line with us from Austin, Texas. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Noelle.
All right, so there are some really disturbing details in this report. What else does it say?
Well, last month, the DHS inspectors visited 5 Border Patrol stations in 2 ports of entry in the Rio Grande Valley. That's the southern tip of Texas that has the most illegal crossings in the nation. They found hundreds of children had been in jail cells, totally inappropriate for kids, for more than 72 hours, which is the federal limit. In one instance, they found 50 small kids younger than 7 years old who'd been in these conditions for over 2 weeks. They didn't have access to showers. There was no laundry to wash their clothes they'd been traveling in. Some were not getting hot meals. You remember we heard similar stories a couple of weeks ago from the lawyers who visited those very sad children crowded into holding cells in Clint, Texas. And the auditors of this recent report said they were concerned that overcrowding and prolonged detention represent an immediate risk to the health and safety of detainees and DHS agents.
Okay, this is really interesting, John, because we think of this as a problem for migrants, especially those children. But this report makes clear it's not just them. Why are DHS agents and officers also at risk?
Well, like you said, one senior DHS manager called this a ticking time bomb. The auditors said they had to cut short their visit to one station because they were afraid they would cause a riot.
Wow.
Migrants were banging on windows and pointing to their beards to show how long they'd been in there. Some had already attempted to escape. A really alarming situation.
So earlier this week, John, on Monday, a couple of high-profile lawmakers visited some of these facilities.
Right.
They were very, very critical in what they reported back. And there's been a lot of criticism from the public as well, too. How is this all adding up?
Well, the backlash is clearly growing. I mean, I'd say it's on a par with the outrage over the Trump administration's family separation policy last year. Both Democratic office holders and demonstrators are up in arms about all the ways the government detains unauthorized migrants, from these Border Patrol cells to child shelters. Take a listen to this.
Close the camps! Close the camps! Close the camps!
That's a protest that happened yesterday in Austin, where I live. About 300 folks showed up in a downtown park. It was one of dozens of organized protests that took place across the country. They were calling on the Trump administration to close the facilities where they keep kids and reunite them with relatives living in the U.S.
All right, so the DHS under a tremendous amount of pressure. What are they saying in response?
Well, they say the situation on the southern border is an acute and worsening crisis. To dramatize it, they said in May they were detaining an average of 4,600 people a day up and down the border. That's compared to fewer than 700 people a day 2 years ago, and there's simply no place to put them all. The government has already added a couple of 500-bed tents where the migrants can live, and they're adding a third. But CBP says their facilities are at peak capacity.
So essentially, we're doing the best we can. NPR's John Burnett in Austin. John, thanks so much.
You bet.
All right, President Trump does not seem to think that his fight to add a question about citizenship to the 2020 census is over just yet.
Right, even though the legal debate clearly is over. The Supreme Court said the administration's rationale for adding this question about citizenship wasn't sufficient. And the administration itself announced yesterday that it's going to go forward. It's going to print the census without that question. Last night, the president, though, complained about the developments on Twitter.
NPR's Hansi Lo Wang has been covering the census. He joins us now from New York. Good morning, Hansi.
Good morning, Noelle.
All right. So what is the deal? Is this fight over or is it not over yet?
Well, now that President Trump has tweeted, it's unclear. He said last night he's asking the Justice Department and the Commerce Department to do more to look in to see if there can be a successful conclusion to this case. What that means, we're not sure, but we do know that the Supreme Court, again, has blocked this question for now, and that printing has started on the 2020 census paper forms without this question. Is this person a citizen of the United States? I asked a Justice Department spokesperson yesterday after that announcement was made to confirm, is this the final decision of the Trump administration? And I got a text back saying, confirm, no question on 2020 census. And I'm watching to see if there's a formal agreement signed between the administration and challengers of this question in Maryland that's being ordered by a federal judge.
So the president is airing his grievances on Twitter, but groups who opposed putting that question on the census, they're basically saying, like, we won, right?
Right. A lot of groups that are challenging this question, that challenge this question in the courts, they are claiming victory. California Attorney General Javier Becerra, his office was the first to file a lawsuit last year after this question was announced. And yesterday he called for everyone to essentially move on from this issue and to think about the census more broadly. Let's listen to what he said.
In order to get the funding our communities need, to get the government the needed resources, so that we know how big our communities are and where people are located, we need to participate.
And that really is the challenge here, to get people to participate. And the concern is that all of this attention on the citizenship question, the legal challenges, has really essentially maybe tainted the well for a lot of immigrant communities of color who are concerned about participating in the census. And also a big question, will the president keep tweeting about the census and the citizenship question?
Yeah. But now the forms are being printed. So what happens next in the census timeline?
Well, we're going to see if President Trump is ready to give up this question or not. And, what's interesting is that if President Trump or the Trump administration really wants to know who is or who isn't a U.S. citizen living in the country, the Census Bureau actually has been compiling records from other federal agencies, records that they say are more accurate than any self-reported responses to a citizenship question. And Census Bureau officials say they're ready to release this information. They just need an okay from the Commerce Secretary who oversees the Census Bureau. So we'll see what happens with those records.
Hansi, just briefly, this is like a big operation. What are other challenges to getting an accurate count?
A big one is really to get every household in the country to participate, to volunteer this information. And there is a big effort to hire workers to make sure there are enough workers to follow up with households that don't respond themselves.
Interesting. NPR's Hansi Lo Wang. Thanks, Hansi.
You're welcome.
All right, big 4th of July celebrations are a normal part of life in Washington, D.C. It is the capital, of course. But this year, there's a fight over how exactly to celebrate.
Yep, President Trump is promising that this year's festivities here in Washington will be different.
It'll be like no other. It'll be special, and I hope a lot of people come, and it's going to be about this country, and it's a salute to America.
The president plans to give an address on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There will be a parade, a whole lot of military pomp and circumstance, including tanks and a flyover. Democrats are taking issue with who is getting special access to the events and who's going to pay for all of it.
NPR's Capitol Hill correspondent Claudia Grisales has been following this story. Good morning, Claudia.
Good morning.
All right, so what all does the White House have planned for tomorrow?
So there will be all of the traditional elements, a parade down Constitution Avenue, a concert that night at the U.S. Capitol, and of course, the fireworks. They usually go about 17 minutes. This year, it's going to be twice as long. And there will be some new things. There's going to be a flyover by the Blue Angels. That's the Navy Ceremonial Flight Squadron. All of this because President Trump will be giving a speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And this will also attract a slew of protesters. I've heard there are plans for the Baby Trump blimp to make an appearance. And on Monday, the president said that people in D.C. would also see big, heavy tanks around the Lincoln Memorial, too.
All right. I personally love the idea of 34 minutes of fireworks. But, I mean, this sounds like the definition of a lot. What is it going to cost?
Well, we don't know the total cost yet. The White House and the Pentagon have been very tight-lipped about the exact costs, but there are some details the White House has shared. And some lawmakers are worried about an overnight Washington Post report that the extra pageantry could take $2.5 million in maintenance fees away from the National Park Service. The flyovers alone could cost an additional $300,000. Air travelers in D.C. that day can also expect some problems. The Federal Aviation Authority will have to shut down nearby Reagan National Airport for about 2 hours because of the flyovers and the fireworks. And Democratic lawmakers are raising concerns about how expensive this will be. I talked with Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico, who sits on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he's worried that this will be a partisan event that will stick taxpayers with the bill.
There are very specific regulations that talk about turning something into a partisan event, a campaign rally. Those are prohibited. Also, propaganda is prohibited. And so this gets into a very tricky area.
So he's referring to President Trump's tendency to turn public events into basically campaign events or rallies for him. There's one more thing that's troubling people. This event is usually free. It's usually open to the public. But you've been reporting that some people are going to get special access. Who?
Yes, even though previous fourths had one secure area for all visitors, now there will be a new VIP area in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This is where the president is giving his speech, and the White House is issuing some of those tickets to lawmakers and their family and friends. And the RNC has also confirmed that it will be issuing a small number of those tickets, but they also say that's customary for a presidential party to issue such tickets for special events.
And can normal people get a hold of one of those tickets, do you think?
It doesn't appear so at this time.
NPR's Claudia Grisales. Claudia, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Patriotism or partisanship? That's the question surrounding President Trump's plans for the 4th of July celebration here in Washington, D.C.
That's right. Today, the president plans to give an Independence Day speech from the Lincoln Memorial. On Monday, a reporter asked him if he thinks this speech will be for all Americans, and the president said yes. But then 17 seconds later, he started talking about health care policy.
What the Democrats' plan is going to destroy the country, and it's going to be horrible health care. Horrible health care.
So not exactly nonpartisan, but if he gives a partisan political speech today, that could cause some legal problems for the White House.
NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith is with us this morning. She is also host of the NPR Politics podcast. Happy 4th of July, my friend.
Hello, happy 4th of July.
So, President Trump has a history of going to events that are not supposed to be political and then sort of making them political. What do we know do we know anything about the content of the speech today?
Well, and as you say, he has gone to places that are really not supposed to be political, like in Iraq the day after Christmas, talking to the troops where he started attacking Democrats in the middle of his speech. A White House official who declined to be named, so they spoke on background, said that the speech today will be all about celebrating America, the flag, members of the military, specifically said it will not be political. It is a salute to America. That is what the event is being called. But, all assurances about what President Trump will do or say have to be taken with a grain of salt. And critics are already objecting to the fact that the White House gave VIP tickets to the Trump reelection campaign and the Republican Party to hand out to supporters. Now, they defend that, saying, well, this is a pretty common thing. If it was on the South Lawn of the White House, we'd be doing that. And they also say that members of the military and their families, thousands of them, have also gotten these VIP tickets.
So we mentioned that there could be some legal jeopardy for the White House if the president makes an overtly political speech. What might those be? What could those problems be?
Yeah, so there are laws preventing the spending of government resources for political purposes. So if the president starts attacking Democrats or talking about his reelection campaign, that could be a problem. I spoke with Brendan Fisher of the Campaign Legal Center. He says that the campaign might have to reimburse if this turns political.
If this does become a political event, then the president's campaign or the RNC should certainly reimburse Treasury for those costs. This is already shaping up to be a much more expensive 4th of July celebration than past celebrations. And I think there's at least the appearance that the costs are going to benefit President Trump's campaign.
So the Interior Department has been organizing this, and Congress could bring the Interior Department in for hearings and try to collect if this were to happen. Someone familiar with the matter told me that the White House is well aware that some people may accuse the president of making this a political event, and that ethics specialists within the White House and lawyers have been looking at this closely, and that the plan is for the president to act within all applicable ethics rules.
Just real fast, would this be the first time a sitting president gives a national address like this on the 4th of July?
Well, Harry Truman did it on the 175th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and there hasn't been one since then, though remarks from Richard Nixon were piped in 1970, and it was a big mess that ended in tear gas.
Well, and the weather report isn't so awesome for Washington, D.C. Tonight, so we'll see.
Thunderstorms.
Tamara Keith, thank you. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, the fight to keep a controversial citizenship question off the 2020 census seemed all but over. This time yesterday, we were telling you about how the Justice Department confirmed that forms were already being printed without the question.
Without the question. But now a Justice Department official says they have orders to keep looking for a way to ask the question on the census. Now, those orders apparently came in the form of a tweet from President Trump.
Once again, NPR's Hansi Lo Wang joins us to talk about all things census. Hansi, I didn't think we were going to see you for a while, and now here you are, because there was another unexpected development.
Here I am. This was also unexpected, apparently, unexpected by the Justice Department attorneys representing the administration in these cases.
What happened?
What happened essentially was that they realized that the position that they thought they were representing of the administration, that they were ready to move forward with the 2020 census without a citizenship question, actually President Trump doesn't necessarily agree with that, and that he wants the Justice Department and the Commerce Department to try to figure out if there is another way to ask for a citizenship question on the 2020 census in time for it to be added.
But how could this even happen? Didn't the Supreme Court say, no, you can't include the question?
For now. And the Supreme Court also allowed the administration to make another case in court. Essentially, the Supreme Court said, if you can give us another reason, if you can explain another reason that is not the reason the administration originally gave, which is that this question could help better enforce the Voting Rights Act, that could better protect the voting rights of racial minorities, a majority of the Supreme Court said that reasoning, quote, seems to have been contrived.
Contrived. So they didn't buy the administration's justification for the question, but at the same time, they opened the door. They're like, okay, if you can make a better argument, you can come back and try to do that. What do critics say is the real reason for the question?
There are a lot of theories. Plaintiffs in these multiple lawsuits over the citizenship question, the most recent theory that's come up is that this question, through the files of a GOP redistricting strategist, they believe that this question could ultimately be used to help politically benefit Republicans and non-Hispanic white people by redrawing political districts after the 2020 census based on the number of U.S. citizens old enough to vote, not on the number of total residents in any given area. That could ultimately benefit Republicans. So that's one theory. Another one is this a way to use responses so that the census numbers that determine how many congressional seats each state gets after the census, if that number could exclude non-citizens.
But that would be problematic for the court, we would assume, on several different counts.
These would be legal questions that would certainly be challenged in the courts.
So what happens next? I mean, who knows? But what's your best guess?
Well, the Trump administration is facing a deadline. Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern is when a federal judge in Maryland says the Justice Department attorneys have to represent whether or not the Trump administration is going to try to fight for a new reason for the citizenship question. And if they do, the judge is ready to reconsider allegations that adding this question was a form of discrimination and also that there was a conspiracy amongst administration officials.
Meanwhile, the census keeps getting printed.
Exactly, without a citizenship question, as far as we know.
All right, NPR's Hansi-Lo Wang. Maybe we'll see you soon.
Maybe.
Okay, thanks. We appreciate it. All right, we're now going to hear from people in the Gaza Strip about why they won't be there for much longer.
Years of conflict and blockades have made life in the Gaza Strip very hard. Now, the White House has this new proposal to invest billions of dollars in both Gaza and the Palestinian territories, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. And thousands of Gazans in the meantime have been leaving despite the fact that it is very difficult to do that.
All right, NPR's Daniel Estrin has been covering the story and joins us now from Jerusalem. So, Daniel, this is something that you just noticed, right? As you were going back and forth to the Gaza Strip, you just seized on the fact that there were fewer people. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it's really been a major topic of conversation in Gaza. And every time I visited recently, more and more people I have gotten to know in recent years were gone or they were packing their suitcases. It's been really hard to leave Gaza in recent years. It's been under blockade by Egypt and by Israel because Hamas, the militant group, is in control there. But now what you have is a rare window of opportunity to leave because Egypt opened its border last year. It was a kind of goodwill gesture. And so now we're seeing a real brain drain. Doctors, surgeons, web developers, my own journalist colleagues who have left. When you go to the Egyptian border, it's really noisy and busy, and authorities are calling out travelers' names on loudspeakers. And I want you to meet one of those travelers, a 25-year-old college graduate, Zaid El-Kurdi, and he was about to say goodbye to his family.
As you see, these are my brothers. It's really bad for me to leave them, and also really bad to leave my mother and my father. But it's necessary for me to seek a better future because I didn't find my future here.
The estimates are that at least 35,000 people, maybe a lot more, have left Gaza, mostly for Europe.
I mean, for more than a generation, life in Gaza has been difficult, almost unbearable. What has changed now, Daniel?
Well, I think life keeps getting worse. I mean, there are the things that we've heard about for years, the wars, the violence between Israel and Hamas, the spotty electricity, the bad drinking water. Recently, Hamas has cracked down on people protesting them. But a big factor now that's driving people out is economic. There's no real economy in Gaza. Israel restricts certain goods for security reasons. The Palestinian government in the West Bank is also cutting money to Gaza. And you've got this booming population of young people with college degrees and no work. Youth unemployment is above or about 70%. So people are saying we have to build our lives somewhere else.
But there was this plan, right? Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and the guy who's heading up kind of trying to fix the Middle East, went to the region, led this conference in Bahrain, and rolled out this plan that has been geared towards reviving Gaza. Remind us what's in there and how people are responding to it.
Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar plan for infrastructure, for trade. Jared Kushner wants to create 1 million new jobs. He wants to open up the Palestinian territories to the world. But Palestinians don't see any hope in this. Kushner says very clearly none of this plan will go forward without progress on a peace deal. And Gazans don't see that happening anytime soon. And so this is really just the latest chapter in this great exodus of Middle Eastern refugees fleeing the region.
NPR's Daniel Estrin for us from Jerusalem. Daniel, thanks. We appreciate it.
Sure thing. You're welcome.
By President Trump's standards, the speech he delivered at the National Mall last night was not especially political.
What was political was the president reshaping Independence Day festivities to center on him. And he also had one line, quote, "Our nation is stronger today than it ever was before," which suggested his view of the past few years. But the president mostly recited American history, praising heroes of war, science, and civil rights.
It is the spirit, daring and defiance, excellence and adventure, courage and confidence, loyalty and love that built this country into the most exceptional nation in the history of the world.
The speech went ahead despite heavy rain. You could see streaks on the bulletproof glass in front of the president. So how did this all play to the crowds who were there and put up with the weather? Ellie Yu of member station WAMU was on the ground. Hi, Ellie.
Hi, Noel.
So what was it like there last night?
Oh, so it was, the National Mall was just full of groups of different types of people. You had tourists from around the world just happening to be visiting D.C. You had a bunch of president's supporters in with wearing red Make America Great t-shirts, hats. And then you had protesters who were there as well. There was a group called Code Pink. It's an anti-war group. They inflated a 20-foot baby Trump balloon, and I ran into other volunteers and protesters passing out mini versions of that as well. And then you had just the regular folks who wanted to come and watch the fireworks as they do every year on the National Mall.
I mean, there were concerns that some of the president's supporters and some of the protesters might scuffle, might get into fights. Did any of that happen? Did you see any of that?
During the afternoon before the speech, there were some scuffles. There were a couple of people arrested outside of the White House after a flag burning protest. But for the most part, it remained pretty calm. There were a lot of people there with their young kids, with their families. So it was a pretty festival type sort of event.
And then the president's speech is really interesting. As Steve pointed out, it started with these tributes to American ingenuity. The president talked about advances in science, in the arts. Jazz came up, Western movies, the Super Bowl. It was really pretty rambly, but sort of inspiring, I suppose, in a lot of ways. What was the mood like while he was talking?
So they're closer to the Lincoln Memorial where the president was speaking. There were, people were cheering. That was where there was a ticketed VIP section, and people who were supporters of the president were closer to the memorial itself. But further in the back where I was, there were just people who weren't necessarily paying a whole lot of attention to the speech per se. They were watching the flyovers. Some people were saluting as the military aircraft flew over. Some people, but most people had their cell phones up in the air just documenting the whole thing.
So the mood, it sounds like, was fairly chill. I know you spoke to a lot of people. Did anyone in particular stand out?
I spoke to one gentleman who was flying in from Seattle. He was there with his family, and not necessarily for the president's speech, but he said he was surprised that the president didn't dive into partisan politics. He himself would have liked a 4th of July that didn't celebrate the military per se, but that he was relieved that the president didn't dive into partisan politics.
I think a lot of people were surprised by that, yeah. Ellie Yu of NPR member station WAMU. Ellie, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, in Sudan, the military and civilian leaders are agreeing to share power until the country can hold elections.
Sudan has faced a crisis since April when protests led to the ouster of the longtime president. He was a military-backed ruler, and while the military agreed to remove him, they kept control of the government. And that was not enough for pro-democracy protesters. Clashes left more than 100 people dead, according to human rights groups, before this temporary agreement.
Reporter Halima Gikandi has been following this story, and she's on the line from Nairobi via Skype. Hi, Halima.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So a deal has been struck. What are the terms of the deal?
Sure. So the deal is a power sharing agreement between a coalition of opposition groups and the Transitionary Military Council, which has been leading the country since the ousting of President Bashir in April. It essentially agrees for both sides to lead through a sovereign council that consists of 6 civilians, one with actually with a military background, and then 5 members of the military. It agrees to establish a rotational presidency, beginning with the military, a military-appointed president for 21 months, followed by one appointed by the civilian side of this agreement. And it also will allow a prime minister to be appointed by the opposition coalition, which I spoke with one of those leaders today, and he says that we can expect that by the end of next week, and that prime minister will be in charge of selecting a cabinet of ministers to start getting the country back to a functioning state.
But what's notable here is that the military will get the presidency first, and then the civilians later on. Do people trust this, given that they spent 30 years living under an autocratic dictator, Omar al-Bashir, who came from the military?
Well, of course, there's been a lack of trust for especially in the past few months since the ousting of the former president. These negotiations have been going on and off. And last month, mid-negotiations, the military completely dispersed protests in a very violent way. So no, there's no trust. But according to the opposition, it's one of the only ways to begin putting Sudan on a path of a functioning transitional government. And of course, all eyes will be watching to make sure that the terms of this early agreement will be implemented.
Do you imagine this means an end to the protests? I guess the protest movement would have to be united enough for one person to say, okay, guys, now we quit. We've got this agreement. Do you think we'll see any more protests?
I think we could expect to see more protests. Because let's say if the military backs out and at any point of the implementation of this agreement, I'm sure people will be back. And we saw that with the ousting in the fall of the former president. People continued to protest at every stage when there was a sense that the military was trying to deny them what they want and what they've been demanding, which is civilian government. So I don't think, as one opposition leader told me today, he said the power is in these people.
Civilian government's still the goal then. Is there any sense, Halima, of when Sudan is going to go ahead and hold elections?
So elections wouldn't be happening for a couple of years.
Wow.
Maybe 3 at the earliest.
And what has been the reaction from Sudanese people? Do ordinary people, are they happy about this?
A lot of people are happy. There was jubilation out in the streets of Khartoum early this morning with the announcement of the agreement. People out in the streets cheering. That said, the Sudanese protesters are focused on their ultimate goal. And yes, this is a first step that everyone's happy about. But at the moment that change, protests will resume.
Reporter Halima Gikandi in Nairobi. Thanks so much, Halima.
Thank you so much.
The United States Congress has debated whether to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, and now Canadians are facing that same question.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is in the middle of a multinational war in Yemen. Civilian casualties and civilian suffering are high, and Saudi Arabia has a poor human rights record, but Saudi money is fueling Canadian jobs.
NPR's Jackie Northam went to the city of London, Ontario, where these questions have become especially important. Good morning, Jackie.
Good morning, Noelle.
Okay, so why has London, Ontario, of all places, become so central to this debate over whether Canada should sell arms to Saudi Arabia?
Well, first of all, London is a nice city of about 500,000 people, and it's about a 2-hour drive west of Toronto. Now, there's a company there, General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, which makes light armored vehicles. And these are 25-ton amphibious vehicles, 8 wheels, turrets on top, that kind of thing. Now, in 2014, the Canadian government signed a deal with Saudi Arabia to sell the kingdom more than 700 of these armored vehicles. And the deal is worth a lot, more than 11 billion US dollars.
Wow.
And the contract went to General Dynamics Land Systems in London.
Okay, so there is a lot of money on the line here. In the United States, this debate has developed as more and more has been revealed about Saudi human rights abuses. Is the same thing happening there? Are people's thoughts on this evolving?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there was opposition to this deal for the armored vehicles right from the get-go, primarily because of Saudi Arabia's poor human rights record. But then came the Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen, and Canadians were very concerned about the high number of civilian casualties and that these armored vehicles might end up being used in the conflict in Yemen. I spoke with Kevin George, the rector at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in London, and he's been very outspoken about the deal. Let's have a listen.
We know what's happening in Yemen, and I think that we're selling arms to a regime which is doing what it's doing in Yemen, which is really paramount to war crimes, and what they're doing to violate human rights, and everything there is just beyond the pale.
Now, Noel, the debate in Canada became much more heated after Saudi columnist and government critic Jamal Khashoggi was killed, apparently by a Saudi hit team in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And there were widespread calls for Canada to get out of the arms deal. And at one point, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau suggested he would do that. But then General Dynamics warned it would cost Canada billions of dollars if it canceled the agreement.
And the thing is, it wouldn't just cost Canada billions of dollars, right? It would also cost something else.
Oh, it sure would. Jobs.
Yeah.
Primarily, yeah. And, it's, at this London plant, business people that I spoke with in London use words like devastating if the deal was canceled. Noel, London has watched a lot of manufacturing jobs leave the area over the past decade or so. And General Dynamics says it directly employs 1,700 highly skilled people and that there are thousands more jobs in the supply chain. I spoke with the owner of a local machine and tool company, and he said he'd lose a third of his workforce if the deal for the armored vehicles went away. And he said, if Canada doesn't build them, there are plenty of other countries that are willing to supply them to Saudi Arabia. So it's really a moral dilemma for Canada. And, this is a country that prides itself on sticking up for human rights.
NPR's Jackie Northam reporting on London, Ontario. Thanks so much, Jackie.
Thank you.